December 23, 1948. The cold morning air in Tokyo carries the weight of justice as 7 war criminals walk to their final moments. Among them, Hideki Tojo, the man who orchestrated Pearl Harbor and led Japan through its darkest chapter. But while history remembers these men and their ultimate fate, a haunting question emerges from the shadows of post-war Japan. What happened to the women they left behind? The wives of Japan's most notorious war criminals faced a reckoning unlike any other in modern history. Some would disappear into obscurity, others would meet tragic ends, and a few would fight against impossible odds to reclaim their dignity. Their stories reveal a side of post-war Japan that history textbooks rarely mention, a world where guilt was inherited, shame was absolute, and survival required extraordinary resilience. Today, we uncover the hidden fate of these women who found themselves married to monsters and discover how their lives unfolded in the aftermath of their nation's greatest defeat. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the country faced complete devastation. Cities lay in ruins, millions were homeless, and the entire social order had collapsed. But for the wives of Japan's military and political leaders, the nightmare was just beginning. The Allied occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, moved swiftly to identify and arrest those responsible for Japan's war crimes. The first wave of arrests began in September 1945, targeting 40 key figures who would later face the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. These arrests didn't just tear apart individual families, they shattered the social fabric of Japan's elite circles. The wives found themselves in an impossible position. Overnight, they transformed from respected members of society to pariahs bearing the weight of their husbands' crimes. Their homes were searched, their assets frozen, and their children faced immediate expulsion from schools. The Japanese concept of collective responsibility meant that shame extended far beyond the individual. It contaminated entire bloodlines. Many of these women had lived privileged lives, surrounded by servants and luxury that came with their husbands' positions. They had attended state functions, hosted foreign dignitaries, and enjoyed the prestige of Japan's ruling class. The grand estates where they had once entertained cabinet ministers and foreign ambassadors were now invaded by Allied investigators. Their private papers were seized, their family photographs scrutinized for evidence of complicity. The transformation was swift and merciless. Women who had once commanded respect from shopkeepers and servants now found themselves treated with contempt and suspicion. Their personal maids abandoned them, their gardeners refused to tend their properties, and their children's private tutors terminated their services without notice. The elaborate social networks that had sustained their lives for decades evaporated in a matter of days. The psychological impact was devastating. Traditional Japanese society placed enormous emphasis on family honor and social standing. For these women, the disgrace wasn't just personal, it was generational. Their children would carry this burden, and their children's children would inherit the stain of their ancestors' actions. The concept of i.e., the family house and its honor, had been destroyed, and with it, their entire sense of identity and purpose. The immediate practical challenges were overwhelming. Many of these women had never handled money, managed households independently, or dealt with government bureaucracy. They had lived sheltered lives where servants and secretaries handled such matters. Now they faced eviction notices, tax demands, and legal documents they couldn't understand. The banking system had collapsed, making it impossible to access what little money might have remained in their accounts. Food became a daily struggle. The rationing system, already strained by wartime shortages, offered little relief to families associated with war criminals. Many former allies in the business community, terrified of guilt by association, refused to provide assistance. These women, who had once dined on delicacies imported from across the empire, now stood in breadlines alongside common laborers and refugees. The children suffered perhaps the most immediate trauma. School administrators, eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the new democratic order, expelled students connected to war criminals without ceremony. These children, who had been taught to take pride in their father's service to the emperor, now faced the devastating revelation that their parents were considered monsters by the world. The psychological whiplash was severe. They had to simultaneously process their father's disgrace while adapting to a completely new social reality. But the most haunting aspect was the uncertainty. While their husbands sat in Sugamo prison awaiting trial, these women had no idea what fate awaited their families. Would they be prosecuted as accomplices? Would they be stripped of citizenship? Would they be able to survive in a society that now viewed them as enemies? The legal system provided no clarity, the media offered no sympathy, and the government extended no support. The answers would come gradually, and for many, the reality would prove even more devastating than their worst fears. Among all the war criminals' wives, none faced a more public ordeal than Katsuko Tojo, the wife of Hideki Tojo. Born into a middle-class family in 1889, Katsuko had married Tojo in 1909 when he was still a young military officer with modest prospects. She had witnessed his rise through the ranks of the Imperial Army and supported him through his ascension to Prime Minister in 1941. When American military police surrounded their home on September 8, 1945, Katsuko experienced one of the most traumatic moments of her life. She heard the muffled gunshot from inside the house and realized her husband had attempted to take his own life rather than face capture. The image of Tojo, bleeding from his chest wound, surrounded by Allied soldiers, would haunt her for the rest of her days. The scene that unfolded in the Tojo residence was chaotic and humiliating. Blood stained the tatami mats in their traditional Japanese sitting room, while American soldiers administered first aid to the man who had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. Katsuko watched in horror as her husband, weakened by blood loss, was carried from their home on a stretcher. The neighbors, who had once bowed respectfully to her, now gathered in clusters, pointing and whispering as the drama unfolded. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Reporters and photographers swarmed their property, turning their private tragedy into a public spectacle. Katsuko found herself at the center of international attention, her every move scrutinized by journalists eager to capture the human face of Japan's defeat. The woman who had once stood beside her husband at state ceremonies now faced cameras that portrayed her as the wife of a monster. For 36 years, Katsuko had been married to a man she thought she knew. She had supported his career, raised their children, and maintained their household through his long absences and demanding schedule. Now she faced the devastating realization that the man she had shared her life with was responsible for some of the most horrific crimes in human history. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the father of her children also be the architect of mass murder? The financial devastation was immediate and complete. All of Tojo's assets were frozen, leaving Katsuko and their children without income or resources. The family home, which had been a symbol of their status and contained decades of memories, was confiscated by the occupation authorities. The fine furniture, artwork, and personal belongings that had defined their comfortable lifestyle were either seized as evidence or sold to pay debts. Katsuko was forced to rely on the charity of distant relatives and former family servants who risked their own social standing to provide assistance. The woman who had once employed dozens of staff members now depended on their kindness for basic survival. Some of these loyal servants, despite their own limited means, quietly provided food and shelter, demonstrating a loyalty that transcended the political circumstances. The social isolation proved even more devastating than the financial hardship. Former friends and associates severed all contact, terrified of being associated with the Tojo name. Katsuko found herself completely ostracized from the social circles she had once moved in freely. The tea ceremonies she had hosted, the charity events she had organized, the cultural gatherings she had attended, all of these social connections vanished overnight. Even basic interactions became impossible. Shopkeepers would refuse to serve her, recognizing her face from newspaper photographs. Neighbors would cross the street to avoid contact, and their children would point and whisper when she passed. The simple act of buying groceries became an ordeal of humiliation and rejection. the woman who had once been treated with deference and respect now faced daily reminders of her fall from grace. The psychological pressure was immense. Katsuko had to grapple with the revelation of her husband's crimes while simultaneously dealing with the collapse of her entire world. She had lived with Tojo for over 3 decades, bearing his children and supporting his career, yet she claimed to have been largely unaware of the full extent of his actions during the war. The traditional Japanese model of marriage, where wives were expected to remain uninvolved in their husbands' professional lives, had left her genuinely ignorant of many of his decisions. Throughout the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which lasted from 1946 to 1948, Katsuko endured the public examination of her husband's role in Japan's wartime atrocities. She attended some of the proceedings, sitting silently as prosecutors detailed the horrific crimes committed under her husband's leadership. The courtroom revelations were devastating. She learned about the treatment of prisoners of war, the conduct of Japanese forces in occupied territories, and the decision-making process that led to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The woman who had once been a respected member of society now faced the world's judgment alongside her husband. International media coverage often focused on her reactions to the testimony, analyzing her facial expressions and body language for signs of remorse or defiance. She became a symbol of Japanese guilt, her presence in the courtroom representing the complicity of the entire nation. During the trial, Katsuko struggled with conflicting emotions. She still loved her husband as the father of her children and her companion of nearly 4 decades, but she was horrified by the evidence of his crimes. The man who had been gentle with their children and considerate in their private life was revealed to be capable of ordering acts of unimaginable brutality. The disconnect between her personal experience and the public evidence created a psychological crisis that would affect her for the rest of her life. The execution of Hideki Tojo on December 23, 1948, marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another for Katsuko. She was denied the right to claim her husband's remains, adding another layer of grief to her already overwhelming burden. The authorities' decision to dispose of the executed war criminals' bodies in secret locations meant that Katsuko could never properly mourn or establish a gravesite for her husband. This final insult was particularly devastating in Japanese culture, where proper funeral rites and ancestor veneration are fundamental to spiritual well-being. Katsuko was denied the ability to perform the traditional ceremonies that would have provided psychological closure and spiritual comfort. The absence of a gravesite meant that her children and grandchildren would never have a place to honor their father's memory, despite his crimes. In the years following the execution, Katsuko lived in near complete obscurity. She moved frequently, trying to escape the constant attention and harassment. She worked various menial jobs to support herself, a dramatic fall from her former position as the wife of Japan's most powerful leader. The skills she had developed as a political wife, organizing events, managing social relationships, representing her husband at public functions, had no value in her new circumstances. The burden of her husband's legacy would follow Katsuko until her death in 1987. She never remarried, never fully escaped the stigma of her association with Japan's wartime leadership, and never found peace with the revelation of her husband's crimes. Her story represents the personal cost of political ambition and the price paid by families for the actions of their most prominent members. The wives of the 7 executed war criminals faced unique challenges that set them apart from other military families. Unlike soldiers who died in battle and were honored for their service, these women were widowed by judicial execution. Their husbands died as convicted war criminals, stripped of all honor and dignity. The 7 men executed on December 23, 1948, left behind wives who would face decades of struggle and social exile. General Kenji Dohara's wife, Hanako, had been married to him for over 30 years and had supported his military career across multiple postings in China. She had believed in his mission to establish Japanese influence in Manchuria and had proudly hosted diplomatic functions in their various residences across the empire. Baron Koki Hirota's widow, Shizuko, faced a particularly complex situation. As the wife of a former prime minister and diplomat, she had been deeply involved in Tokyo's high society and had maintained relationships with foreign diplomats and their wives. Her husband's execution as a war criminal destroyed these international connections and left her isolated from the diplomatic community that had been her life's work. General Seishiro Itagaki's wife, Toshiko, had followed her husband to numerous military postings throughout his career, including extended periods in Korea and Manchuria. She had raised their children in military communities and had been proud of her husband's service to the emperor. The revelation that his actions in China constituted war crimes forced her to confront the reality that the military culture she had embraced was built on systematic brutality. General Heitaro Kimura's widow, Fumiko, had been married to him since 1905 and had supported his rise through the army ranks. She had believed in the righteousness of Japan's cause and had encouraged other military wives to support the war effort. The knowledge that her husband had been responsible for atrocities in Burma and the Philippines created a devastating crisis of conscience that would affect her for the rest of her life. General Iwane Matsui's wife, Cho, faced the particular horror of learning about her husband's role in the events at Nanking. She had known him as a cultured man who appreciated art and literature, and she struggled to reconcile this image with the evidence of his responsibility for mass atrocities. The disconnect between her private knowledge of her husband and his public crimes created a psychological trauma that she never fully resolved. General Akira Muto's widow, Yoshiko, had been married to him for over 20 years and had supported his military career throughout the Pacific War. She had believed in the necessity of Japan's expansion and had sacrificed her own comfort to support his service. The realization that his actions in the Philippines had resulted in his execution as a war criminal forced her to confront the moral implications of her own support for the military regime. The Japanese government provided no support for these families. In fact, they were explicitly excluded from any war widow benefits or assistance programs. This deliberate abandonment forced these women to navigate their grief and practical survival needs completely alone. The contrast was stark. While families of soldiers who died in battle received pensions and social support, the wives of executed war criminals were completely cut off from any official assistance. The social stigma was particularly crushing in Japanese society, where the concept of family honor held profound significance. These women weren't just widowed, they were marked as the wives of traitors to their own people. The shame was considered hereditary, affecting not just them, but their children and grandchildren. Many families changed their surnames and moved to distant regions to escape the stigma. But even these dramatic measures often proved insufficient. The isolation was so complete that it affected every aspect of their lives. They couldn't find housing, as landlords refused to rent to them. They couldn't find employment, as employers feared association with war criminals. They couldn't access medical care, as doctors and hospitals sometimes refused to treat them. The social death was so absolute that it threatened their physical survival. Some of these women experienced what could only be described as a form of social death. They were erased from family records, disowned by relatives, and forgotten by former friends. The isolation was so complete that many suffered severe mental health consequences. Though psychological support was neither available nor culturally acceptable in post-war Japan, the economic situation was equally dire. With all assets frozen and no government support, these women often faced homelessness and starvation. Some were forced to sell personal possessions, including family heirlooms and jewelry, just to survive. Others took on menial labor, working in factories or as domestic servants, a dramatic fall from their former positions in society. The work available to them was often the most degrading and poorly paid. They cleaned offices at night, worked in textile factories under harsh conditions, or performed domestic labor for families who treated them with contempt. The contrast between their former lives as respected military wives and their new reality as social outcasts was devastating to their sense of self-worth and dignity. The most tragic cases involved women who couldn't cope with the overwhelming burden of their circumstances. Several wives of executed war criminals took their own lives in the months and years following their husbands' executions, unable to bear the shame and isolation. These deaths were rarely reported in the media, as they represented an uncomfortable reminder of the human cost of justice. The methods these women chose reflected their desperation and isolation. Some used traditional approaches that honored their sense of duty and sacrifice, while others simply succumbed to the overwhelming despair of their circumstances. In each case, the loss represented not just personal tragedy, but the failure of society to provide support for innocent family members affected by war crimes proceedings. Yet some of these women demonstrated remarkable resilience. They quietly rebuilt their lives, focusing on their children's education and future prospects. They worked multiple jobs, lived in poverty, and endured daily humiliation, all while maintaining their dignity and protecting their families from further harm. These survivors developed strategies for coping with their circumstances. They formed informal support networks with other stigmatized families, sharing resources and emotional support. They found ways to educate their children despite the discrimination they faced. They discovered employers who were willing to judge them on their own merits rather than their family connections. The most successful among them were those who managed to compartmentalize their lives, maintaining their private grief while building new public identities. They learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of post-war Japan, finding ways to contribute to their communities while managing the burden of their past. Their stories represent some of the most remarkable examples of human resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. While Emperor Hirohito escaped prosecution due to General MacArthur's strategic decisions, the imperial family faced their own form of reckoning. Empress Nagako, who had been at the center of Japanese high society, suddenly found herself in an impossible position. The woman who had once been revered as a living goddess now faced questions about her role in supporting Japan's war effort. The Empress had been deeply involved in wartime activities, particularly in promoting the war effort among Japanese women. She had encouraged mothers to send their sons to die for the emperor and had supported the militaristic policies that led to Japan's aggression. Her public speeches and ceremonial appearances had been carefully crafted to inspire loyalty and sacrifice among the Japanese people. Now she faced the difficult task of reconciling her public support for the war with the horrific reality of Japan's crimes. The imperial family's daily routine was completely transformed under occupation. The vast palace complex, which had once been a symbol of divine authority, was now under constant surveillance by Allied forces. American military personnel monitored their movements, screened their communications, and observed their interactions with visitors. The family, who had once lived in sacred isolation, now faced the constant presence of foreign soldiers who viewed them as potential threats to democratic reform. The Empress's personal staff was dramatically reduced, and many longtime servants were dismissed or chose to leave rather than face association with the defeated imperial system. The elaborate court rituals that had structured her daily life were abandoned, leaving her without the familiar patterns that had defined her existence. The woman who had been surrounded by ceremony and protocol now faced long stretches of empty time with nothing to fill the void left by her lost status. The imperial family's isolation during the occupation was profound. They were confined to the palace grounds, their movements restricted, and their communications monitored. For Empress Nagako, who had enjoyed considerable freedom and influence, this confinement was a stark reminder of how completely their world had changed. She could no longer travel freely, visit temples, or maintain the social connections that had sustained her throughout her married life. The psychological burden was immense. The Empress had to witness her husband's humiliation as he was forced to renounce his divinity and accept responsibility for the war. She watched as the entire imperial system that had defined her life was dismantled piece by piece. The woman who had been taught from childhood that she was part of a sacred institution now faced the reality that this was all a construct that could be destroyed by military defeat. The revelation of Japan's wartime atrocities created a particular crisis for the Empress. She had genuinely believed in the righteousness of Japan's cause and had used her position to promote what she thought was a holy war. The evidence of systematic brutality, civilian massacres, and prisoner abuse forced her to confront the possibility that her entire worldview had been built on lies. The cognitive dissonance was devastating. How could the sacred mission she had supported result in such horrific crimes? The Empress's children faced their own traumatic adjustments. The crown prince, who had been prepared to inherit divine authority, now had to contemplate a future as a symbolic figurehead in a democratic system. The younger children, who had been raised in isolation and privilege, suddenly faced the possibility of living as ordinary citizens. The family's entire understanding of their purpose and destiny was shattered by Japan's defeat. The financial situation, while not as dire as that faced by war criminals' families, was still challenging. The imperial family's vast wealth was substantially reduced, and they faced restrictions on their spending and lifestyle. Properties were confiscated, art collections were seized, and the elaborate household expenses that had supported hundreds of staff members were dramatically cut. For someone who had lived in unimaginable luxury, these changes represented a significant adjustment. The Empress had to learn new skills and adapt to a much more modest lifestyle. She had to manage household tasks that had previously been handled by servants, make decisions about family finances that had once been managed by court officials, and navigate government bureaucracy that had previously been handled by palace administrators. The practical challenges of daily life, which had been invisible to her throughout her privileged existence, now became immediate concerns. Most importantly, Empress Nagako had to grapple with the moral implications of her position. She had been a symbol of Japanese nationalism and militarism, and now she faced the reality of what that symbolism had cost her nation and the world. The weight of this realization would affect her for the rest of her life, creating a burden of guilt and responsibility that she could never fully escape. The Empress's relationship with her husband was also affected by these revelations. She had supported his decisions and had been his partner in promoting the war effort. Now they both faced the knowledge that their actions had contributed to immense suffering and destruction. The private conversations between them during this period must have been filled with grief, regret, and mutual recrimination as they struggled to understand how their sacred mission had led to such catastrophic results. The Empress's experience during this period would shape her approach to her role for the remainder of her life. She became more cautious, more aware of the political implications of her actions, and more conscious of the need to support democratic values rather than imperial ambitions. The trauma of Japan's defeat and the revelation of its wartime crimes would influence her decisions and public statements for decades to come. While the wives of executed war criminals faced the finality of death, those whose husbands received prison sentences faced a different kind of torment, the prolonged agony of uncertainty and gradual social death. These women lived in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward with their lives while their husbands served lengthy sentences in Sugamo prison. The wives of the imprisoned war criminals faced a unique form of psychological torture. Unlike widows who could eventually begin to process their grief and rebuild their lives, these women existed in a permanent state of limbo. They were neither married nor single, neither free to remarry, nor able to maintain normal marital relationships. Their husbands were alive but inaccessible, present but absent, a constant reminder of their diminished status. General Sadao Araki's wife, Matsuko, exemplified this impossible situation. Her husband had been sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in promoting Japanese militarism and expansionism. She had supported his political career and had been proud of his influence in shaping Japan's national ideology. Now she faced the reality that his beliefs had led to war crimes, convictions, and that she would spend the rest of her life as the wife of an imprisoned war criminal. The visits to Sugamo prison became a ritual of humiliation for these women. They were subjected to thorough searches, interrogations, and surveillance by Allied personnel. The brief meetings with their husbands were conducted under strict supervision, with conversations monitored and limited to approved topics. These encounters often left the women more distressed than comforted, as they witnessed the gradual deterioration of their husbands' physical and mental health. The prison visits required elaborate preparation and planning. The women had to request permission weeks in advance, submit to background checks, and provide detailed explanations for their visits. They were limited in what they could bring to their husbands. No gifts, no personal items, no written messages. Even the food they could provide was strictly regulated. with every item inspected and approved by prison officials. The psychological impact of these visits was devastating. The women saw their husbands transformed from powerful, confident leaders into broken, dependent prisoners. The men who had once commanded armies and shaped national policy now seemed diminished and vulnerable. The contrast between their public personas and their prison reality was stark and deeply disturbing for their wives. The social isolation was particularly cruel because it was ongoing. While the wives of executed war criminals could eventually begin to rebuild their lives, those with imprisoned husbands remained in limbo. They were neither widowed nor properly married, existing in a social gray area that made it difficult to form new relationships or find acceptance in any community. The stigma affected every aspect of their lives. They couldn't find decent housing, as landlords feared association with war criminals. They couldn't access quality health care, as medical professionals sometimes refused to treat them. They couldn't participate in community activities, as other residents would shun them. The isolation was complete and permanent, lasting as long as their husbands remained in prison. Some of these women waited decades for their husbands' release, only to find that the men who returned were broken by their experiences in prison. General Kingo Hashimoto's wife, Kikuko, waited 15 years for her husband's release, only to discover that he had been fundamentally changed by his imprisonment. The man who returned to her was psychologically damaged, physically weakened, and unable to resume his role as husband and father. The relationships that survived were often fundamentally changed, with both partners struggling to reconnect after years of separation and trauma. The women had been forced to become independent and self-reliant, while their husbands had been institutionalized and dependent. The power dynamics that had previously defined their marriages were completely altered, creating new sources of conflict and misunderstanding. The most successful of these families were those who managed to completely reinvent themselves. They changed their names, moved to new locations, and created entirely new identities. This process required enormous courage and determination, as it meant abandoning not just their past, but their entire sense of self. Some families split apart entirely, with wives and children choosing to sever all connections with their imprisoned husbands and fathers. The legal system provided no guidance or support for these families. There were no established procedures for handling the wives and children of war criminals, no social services designed to help them navigate their circumstances, and no legal protections against discrimination. They were left to manage their situations entirely on their own, with no institutional support or advocacy. The psychological toll on these women was severe and long-lasting. Many developed depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems that were never properly diagnosed or treated. The shame, isolation, and financial stress created a perfect storm of psychological distress that affected their physical health and longevity. Some never recovered from the trauma of their experiences and lived their remaining years in poverty and obscurity. Despite the overwhelming challenges they faced, some wives of Japanese war criminals managed to rebuild their lives and find new meaning in their circumstances. These women's stories represent some of the most remarkable examples of human resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. One such woman was the wife of a mid-level military officer who had been convicted of war crimes in Southeast Asia. After her husband's execution, she was left with 3 young children and no resources. Rather than succumb to despair, she used her education and intelligence to create a new life for her family. She had been educated in traditional Japanese arts and literature, skills that seemed useless in post-war Japan's practical economy. However, she discovered that American occupation forces were interested in Japanese culture and tradition. She began by teaching Japanese language and customs to Allied personnel, gradually building a reputation as a cultural bridge between the occupying forces and Japanese society. Her work required her to overcome her initial hatred and resentment toward the Americans who had executed her husband, but she recognized that cooperation was essential for her family's survival. Her business expanded from language instruction to cultural consultation, helping American companies understand Japanese customs and business practices. She became one of the first Japanese women to establish an independent business during the occupation period, eventually employing other war criminals' wives who needed income. Her success allowed her to send her children to good schools and provide them with opportunities that seemed impossible in the immediate aftermath of the war. The transformation required her to completely reimagine her identity. She had been raised to be a traditional Japanese wife, obedient and dependent on her husband. Now she had to become an independent businesswoman, negotiating with foreign clients and managing employees. The psychological adjustment was enormous, but she found strength in her responsibility to her children and her determination to prove that she could succeed despite her circumstances. Another remarkable case involved the wife of a naval officer who had been sentenced to life imprisonment. Instead of waiting passively for her husband's release, she became an advocate for prison reform and war criminal rehabilitation. She worked with Allied authorities to improve conditions at Sugamo Prison and helped other war criminals' families navigate the complex bureaucracy of the occupation. Her advocacy work was controversial and dangerous. Many Japanese viewed her cooperation with Allied authorities as betrayal, while some Allied officials suspected her motives and questioned her loyalty. She faced criticism from both sides, but she persisted in her efforts because she believed that improving conditions for all prisoners would benefit her husband and other war criminals. She organized support networks for war criminals' families, helping them find housing, employment, and educational opportunities for their children. She lobbied for changes in prison policies, arguing that rehabilitation rather than punishment should be the goal of incarceration. Her efforts eventually led to improvements in visiting procedures, male privileges, and medical care for prisoners. Her work also had a personal dimension. She used her position to maintain regular contact with her husband and provide him with emotional support during his imprisonment. She helped him maintain his dignity and purpose during his incarceration, encouraging him to use his time productively and prepare for his eventual release. Her dedication and love sustained him through the darkest period of his life. When her husband was finally released after 15 years in prison, their reunion was both joyful and challenging. He had been fundamentally changed by his imprisonment, and she had been transformed by her independence and advocacy work. They had to rebuild their relationship from scratch, learning to live together again after years of separation. The process was difficult, but their love and commitment to each other helped them navigate the challenges. Perhaps most inspiring was the story of a woman whose husband had been executed for his role in the treatment of prisoners of war. She channeled her grief and guilt into a lifelong mission of reconciliation, working with former Allied prisoners of war to establish dialogue and understanding between former enemies. Her efforts helped heal wounds that had seemed impossible to bridge and demonstrated that even the deepest trauma could be transformed into something positive. Her reconciliation work began with a simple gesture. She wrote letters to the families of prisoners of war who had been affected by her husband's actions, expressing her sorrow and accepting responsibility for his crimes. Many of these letters were never answered, but some recipients were moved by her sincerity and began corresponding with her. These exchanges evolved into face-to-face meetings and eventually into formal reconciliation ceremonies. She organized events where former prisoners of war could meet with Japanese families affected by the war, creating opportunities for mutual understanding and forgiveness. These gatherings were emotionally intense and sometimes difficult, but they provided healing for both sides. Former enemies found common ground in their shared humanity and their desire to prevent future conflicts. Her work extended to historical education, helping to establish museums and memorial sites that accurately portrayed the experiences of both Japanese and Allied personnel during the war. She insisted on presenting the full truth about Japanese war crimes, while also acknowledging the suffering of Japanese civilians and families. Her approach was balanced and honest, earning respect from both former enemies and her own countrymen. The reconciliation work gave her life new meaning and purpose. She found that helping others heal from the trauma of war also helped her process her own grief and guilt. The positive impact of her work provided a sense of redemption that allowed her to find peace with her past while contributing to a better future. These women succeeded by refusing to be defined by their husbands' crimes. They acknowledged the past without being imprisoned by it, and they found ways to contribute positively to society despite their stigmatized status. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity and resilience can prevail. The common thread among these successful women was their ability to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. They invested their energy in their children's education, their own personal growth, and their community's welfare. They understood that they couldn't change what had happened, but they could influence what came next. Their success required enormous courage and determination. They had to overcome not just external obstacles, but also internal psychological barriers. They had to find strength in themselves that they didn't know they possessed, and they had to maintain hope when all evidence suggested that their situations were hopeless. The families of Japanese war criminals, especially their wives, children, and grandchildren, faced long-lasting stigma that extended well beyond the immediate post-war period. In a society where family background heavily influenced marriage and career prospects, their relatives were often socially ostracized and discriminated against. Children of war criminals grew up hiding their identities, often fabricating family histories to avoid shame. This secrecy caused lifelong psychological distress, anxiety, depression, and deep identity confusion. Hidekazu Tojo, son of executed Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, faced severe employment discrimination and lived under an assumed name. He never married, likely due to the burden of his family legacy. Daughters encountered marriage barriers, as traditional families rejected any ties to war criminals. Those who did marry often concealed their past, straining their relationships and sometimes leading to collapse when the truth emerged. Marriage within similarly stigmatized families became common, as outside acceptance was rare. Thorough background checks during marriage negotiations and job applications further entrenched exclusion. Careers in government, education, and elite industries were usually off-limits. Some found limited opportunity in emerging sectors that valued merit over pedigree, but the fear of exposure remained. The psychological toll was immense. Many children struggled with conflicting feelings, loving their fathers while condemning their actions. Some changed names and cut ties with their past, sacrificing identity and heritage for a chance at a new life. Others confronted the legacy head-on, trying to reconcile with it and seek redemption. As post-war Japan rapidly modernized, attitudes toward the families of war criminals gradually shifted. The economic boom of the 1960s and 70s opened new paths for social mobility, allowing some families to rebuild their lives through education and business. Japanese society became more meritocratic, valuing individual achievement over family background. Labor shortages forced companies to relax hiring standards, and younger generations, shaped by democratic values and new educational content, were more likely to judge people on personal merit rather than inherited guilt. Still, change was uneven. Traditional attitudes, especially in rural areas, remained strong, where intimate communities and known family histories reinforced stigma. Families often moved to cities seeking anonymity and opportunity. The media played a mixed role. Early sensational coverage reinforced shame, but later documentaries and academic work offered more nuanced views, exploring the complexities of individual responsibility and humanizing affected families. Education and international exchange further helped reshape public understanding, promoting a more balanced perspective on Japan's wartime past. As Japan grew globally engaged and economically successful, national pride replaced some of the guilt, easing social pressure on stigmatized families. Yet full integration remained elusive. Discrimination persisted in conservative sectors and government employment. The urban-rural divide was stark. Cities offered a fresh start, but smaller towns often clung to old prejudices. For many families, partial acceptance brought psychological strain. Success in some areas contrasted with exclusion in others, leaving them in a state of ongoing uncertainty and emotional conflict. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.